Now the next thing I want to go over isn't really specific to mobile apps. But if you start creating more mobile apps and using more data on your pages, you'll probably run into it. So we're going to go over it now, and that's JavaScript Arrays. Now I've got another file loaded up that we can use to work on it, so let me close up the file we've been working on, and we'll open up number 3, try JavaScript Arrays. I'll pull it open in the browser, and of course my text edit application. So far I've just got a simple file here. Aside from our title, we've got a simple button called List Names, and we've got a paragraph and a div, both of which are empty but have IDs of names and list. Down in our script tag, we've got a window on load function that's empty and ready to be filled up, and a list name function that appears to be set up to our buttons up here at the top. And we'll just use these items to see how our arrays work. An array stores things just like a variable, so that's a good place to start. I'm going to make a variable right down inside my script window that we can use to store names. And as an example, I'll just set it equal to Bob as our first name. Now just so we can see the names that are loaded into the variable, on the window on load function, I'm going to use getElementById and insert the names into the names paragraph up here at the top. So I'll start with document.getElementById. And we'll look for the names paragraph. We'll specify its inner HTML property. And we'll set that equal to our variable, names. Of course, if I save this change, and we go and refresh our page, we should see Bob show up in our paragraph. So we know how a variable works. But as you can see, I call this variable the plural of names because I want to store a bunch of different names. In fact, we want a whole list of names. Now we can make up several different variables like name1, name2, and name3, but that's very difficult to manage, especially if we don't know how many names are on the list. So what we want to use is an array. The first thing about an array that's different is we see a different syntax in JavaScript. It uses square brackets to enclose its values. So if I just take this script that I have so far, and I add in square brackets around the value of Bob, like so, we have just created an array. And since we only have one thing in it, it's an array of one element. Now that's not going to change our script yet, but what's neat about arrays is they can store more than one value. That's why we have the square brackets. Anything inside the square brackets is part of the array. And if we want more names, I simply add them inside and separate them by a comma. So for instance, I could add Mary, and then put in another comma, and add in Pat. Now let's see what happens. I'll save my changes. We'll refresh our page. And now you can see that the display shows us Bob, Mary, and Pat. It shows all three names. So my array can store more than one thing. Now we use arrays to store things, but sometimes you don't want all the names dumped out. For instance, what if I just want the middle name Mary dropped out here? Well, this is where we can use special array syntax again. I'll modify this so it only shows me one name. And what I do is, instead of setting it up equal to names, which will give me all three, I use names and then add square brackets on the end of it. And then I can specify the item that I'm looking for by its position in the array. I basically count from the beginning. 1, 2, 3, that would mean Mary is the second item in the array. But there's one more thing to remember, and that is, when we count items in an array, we don't start with 1, we actually start with 0. So Bob is item 0, Mary would be item 1, and Pat would be item 2. As long as we keep that in mind, we can go back over to our code here, and inside the square brackets, I'll use the number 1 to specify that I want the second element of the array, which is Mary. Now let's save that change. We'll go out and test our page, and we can see that we're only showing Mary now because we picked that item out in the array. And of course, if we just change the number around, we can specify which element we're looking for. I'll put in 0, and that should put us back to Bob again. Save that change, go out and refresh the page, and there you can see Bob is showing. Well, now that we've seen what an array is, let's take a look at how to work with the items in the array. The first thing we find out is that arrays have a lot of different useful functions. I'll just show one to give you an idea. If we want to add a new item to the array, we can use a push function. Let's try it like this. We've set up our original names array with 3 names included. I'll just add a line below it, and we'll set up our names array. and call the push function. It's a function, so I need to set up parentheses. And inside the parentheses, we basically specify the item we want to push into the array. I'm going to set it up for another name. So I'm going to push in Jane. We'll close off the parentheses. And I'll modify my function down here so we go back to displaying all the names inside the array instead of just the first or second one. So I'll remove the square brackets. We'll save our changes. And when we go back up and refresh the page, you can see that when we display the array, we get all 4 names. So we have the original names that were added into the array, and you can see that Jane was pushed right at the end. Now there's one more thing that I want to do, and that is loop through an array, so I can work on each individual item inside the array. And that's what we're going to do down here in List Names. What I want to do is set it up so that when the user clicks the List Names button, it's going to list each name individually instead of dumping them out all at once like it does right up here. Now all we're doing is listing the names, but obviously using this function, we could do anything else we want to each individual name and make sure that we do it to all the items in the array. To do so, we're going to set up a typical for loop. So let's set up our list names function. Since I want to output the results here, I want to set up a variable that's going to keep track of all the output that I need to dump onto the page. So we'll do that first. I'll give it some starter text. We'll add the title, the names are. I'll put in a colon, a space, and we'll add in a line break so it goes down to the next line. Then I can close up my quotes, and that'll be the start of my output variable. Next, we need to set up a for loop, and we want it to loop through all the items in the array. So we'll set up the for loop structure first. We start off with the for keyword, and then we need a condition that's going to count how many times we're going to repeat the operation. I like to use a variable for this. So I'm going to create a variable called I. It's very typically used inside of for loops, but you can use any variable name you want. I'll set it equal to 0 to start with because we want to start working at the first array element. Then we need to specify how high I is going to go. And basically, we want this to continue as long as there's items in the array. So I'll set it as I less than, and then we just need the items inside the array. And there happens to be a special property for that. We go back to our array, which is called names, and we use dot syntax to access the length property. Length is a value that just tells you how many items are in the array. So in the case of our array, it started off with 3 items, but then we added another one, so the current length is 4. Then we need to update our I value, so I'll add a semicolon here, and we'll use I and our plus plus operator, which will add 1 to it each time we loop through the array. Now I can close off my for loop condition, and then set up some grouping braces for the items that I want to loop. Now here's what we'll do. We'll just add each name onto the output as it goes through the loop. So I'll set output and use the plus equals operator to add more items onto it. That will keep the original value and simply add anything else right here at the end. For each item, I want the name. So I'm going to use names, that's my array, and I'm going to use the square bracket syntax to be able to extract one item at a time. I want to go through the items in order, starting with 0, going to 1, 2, and then 3. And that's exactly how my I variable works. So I'll just insert I into here. I'll close off my square brackets. And just so we can carry this on to the next line, I'll add into the output another line break for each name. So we'll need quotes around that since this is just characters. Now, each time we work through the loop, we'll extract a name from the list and add a line break after it. And we'll keep doing this until we run out of names. Now, the last thing I need to do, of course, is take this output variable and drop it into the list of names, which we have up here as a div. So, when my loop is finished, I'm going to use document getElementById. We'll grab our list ID and set the inner HTML property equal to our output. Now we've got enough to try out our list names button. Let's save our changes. Let's go back to our document and we'll refresh to make sure we're using the new code. And we can see up the top that we have 4 names in our list. When I click the list names button, you can see the names are, and then we're followed by each one of the names with a line break inserted afterwards. Now, if you start working with JavaScript or downloading other JavaScript files, you'll be able to see the use of these arrays lots of different places. The one thing that you should look for is square brackets, because in JavaScript, the square bracket basically tells you that you're working with an array.